Sydney's apartment disasters. Let's have a look. Good evening, everyone. Florian Heise here, and welcome to another episode of Heise Says. I'm stein of coffee in hand, and I thought we'd look at an interesting article. Now, this is from the Sydney Morning Herald. No, sorry, the WA Today. The WA Today, and it's regarding Godzilla apartments in the suburb and the truth behind Sydney's ugly apartment blocks. Now, what I wanted to do, something a bit different, is to go look at this article, then look at some architecture theory. We're going to do a bit of a lecture, and we'll be going through two books today, or portions of two books. Now, the first is, and I'll bring over here, a pattern language. Or one of the books is a pattern language. We'll probably go through Great Streets first, but a pattern language. Now, if you know anyone that's studying architecture, or you know an architect that doesn't have this book, this makes an excellent present. It is, frankly, one of the best books I ever encountered at university. It's written by Christopher Alexander and a whole bunch of other people, and it really has a whole series of different patterns and examples and just design ideas. And it goes from macro, regional design all the way down to positions of a column. So I can't recommend it enough. And there's, of course, an Amazon affiliate link in the description. And then the second book, or the first one we'll be looking at, but the second book I'm going to refer to is Great Streets by Alan B. Jacobs. And this is just a fantastic book with regards to, great streets. And we'll be looking at that because that's what we're dealing with. We're looking at, streets in the city. We're designing buildings for human scale. And we tend to have lost our way a little bit, I would say. Lost some of the lessons of the past. Here in Queensland, they're proposing new planning guidelines. And they want to get rid of cul-de-sacs, which, are just dead ends and allow zero navigation in the city. So it'll be good to see. It'll be good to see. And I'll do a video in more detail on that one once I've had a look at it. But let's start by going through this video. So, suburbs across Sydney are scarred with big, fat, dumb apartment buildings that provide poor living spaces for residents, according to two of the city's leading architects. Philip Thallis, who is also a City of Sydney councillor, accused developers of pursuing profits by cramming apartments into a building with excessive footprints. What worries me is these overblown buildings, these Godzillas in the suburbs, are a really bad model, he said. Chris Johnson, the chief executive of the Urban Task Force, a group representing the development industry, said councils and restrictive planning rules were to blame for dumpy buildings. I'd say it's somewhere between the two sides of the argument. I think it's, developers are to blame, as well are the restrictive council rules, because we'll read a bit further, and some of the rules they have in New South Wales are just insane. Councils need to be more flexible with height to encourage slimmer towers, he said. Sean Carter, a past president of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Institute of Architects, said, "Tall, thin towers were preferable to lower, bulkier buildings. We know these qualities make better buildings, better streets, and better cities. But squat buildings are cheaper to construct," Mr. Carter said. There's the less external envelope you have, the less glass, the less you have to insulate and waterproof, the less expensive materials you need to use. This is clearly beyond some builders and developers in Sydney at present, he said. Well, it depends how tall you get. It depends. There's a whole lot of different approaches to this, and it comes to how you want your city to look, how you want people to live in the city. But I would say, looking at this skyline, that's you wouldn't really say that's human scale, would you? Steve Mann, the chief executive of the Urban Development Institute of Australia, New South Wales, said developers were constrained by planning rules set by councils and the state government. Currently, regulatory authorities are so prescriptive with controls, and development tax is so high that developments are molded by these constraints. The building is poured into the controls. I think that is probably the most accurate situation that's happening here, because naturally, the government, the states like their revenue, the cities like their revenue. They want to get maximized return from every development they can, and they've got very restrictive requirements. We're going to look at them here. The State Environment Planning Policy number 65 and its companion, the Apartment Design Guide, imposes standards for natural light, outdoor access, and size on new apartment developments, yet there is inadequate enforcement of these rules, Councillor Thallis said. But Planning and Public Spaces Minister Rob Stokes said New South Wales leads the country when it comes to ensuring high-quality design of apartments. Okay, well, maybe high-quality design, but, yeah, sure. Sure, but not high-quality construction. You can't claim that anymore. We'll just, look at the triangle of fail. If we are to have taller buildings, the trade-off must be greater contribution to safe, usable, attractive public open spaces. Now, the challenge here is if you start building, say, all these big towers, and then you create all these, usable spaces down below, and say you got trees and stuff here. Okay, I can't draw with mice, guys. That these spaces here are so inhumane because the building is so high. They're not used. Creates other social issues. So, Councillor Thaler said apartment buildings with large floor plates have been built across Sydney in suburbs such as Kirrawee, Mascot, Pagewood, Homebush and Wentworth Point. The sheer mass is a problem, he said. They're not broken up into smaller buildings. They don't have areas of landscape integrated with their site planning. They're just monoliths. Well, yeah, they are. They really are. And we're going to look at some examples from our favourite suburb, which is Mascot. And I'm just going to move this over a bit because I want it centered. Sorry, guys. He said monolithic buildings make fantastic warehouses, but they're not great places to live. Chris Knapp, the head of Bond University's Aberdeen School of Architecture, said slender buildings had greater visual appearance and caused less overshadowing. For occupants, it means more availability to daylight and natural ventilation. Yes, well, if you have a building, a smaller building, a building footprint, and you try and get ventilation through it, you can do that. But if you've got another apartment on the other side, corridor in the middle, you can't cross-ventilate. It's kind of impossible. However, Professor Knapp said tall buildings can breed anonymity. Once people live too far from the ground, they become detached from the pedestrian realm and the sense of community and connection one has with their neighbours. Well, yeah, I completely agree with that. I'd say there is no sense of community. How many people know their neighbours in these huge buildings? Councillor Thallis and Mr. Carter said a maximum of 6 apartments per floor of an apartment complex was ideal. This usually would mean a more friendly place to live, a more personal corridor space, more area given to apartments, and more surface area for the apartment which would, in the hands of a skilled architect, mean greater amenity and better architecture, Mr. Carter said. But Mr. Johnson said limiting the number of apartments on each floor would drive up property prices. We need to consider affordability and the number of apartments per floor. Yes, but when the higher you get, the more complexity there is, and there's a lot of issues. It'd probably be they want to break up the buildings into different elements. Councillor Thallis said he was not opposed to increasing the city's density, but a focus on short-term profits has led to the building defects crisis and the evacuation of apartment complexes such as Olympic Park, Mascot, and Erskinesville. There's still a lot more to come out about that one. Mr. Carter said buildings should not be just about making profits. They need to be people's homes and workplaces first and foremost, he said. That's why good regulation is needed to make sure this is what actually happens. Well, we'll see. Other parties are blaming the regulation on this. More skilled and stringent planning assessment was needed to improve the design of apartment towers, Mr. Carter said, with architects should be tied to a building until the occupation certificate is issued. Yes, that's not a... Yeah, actually. Because often an architect can get hired to do the first bit, and then, the builder will take over and design and construct, and another architect will come in and finish it off. And I've been on both sides of that situation. He also said there should be greater public sector involvement in building affordable housing to improve standards and lower maintenance costs. In contrast, Mr. Munn said planning was a broken system that did not respond to community needs. State and local controls could be better used as a baseline with buildings and can show better community outcomes to be allowed to be assessed outside of the controls on their merit and response to the needs of the community, he said. Well, that all sounds really good. The problem is they don't have enough resources to do it at the council level. That's the issue. There's not enough resources to do it. So let's have a look. We'll go back in time and we'll look first at Great Streets. Okay, and I'll hold it up again. Here it is. Don't buy the hardcover on Amazon. It's like $400. Get the paperback. It's a fantastic book if you're studying architecture. So here we have an example, and this is from Italy. Oh, actually, I didn't want to look at that one first. We'll just skip down here. Sorry. We'll look at Pompeii first. Pompeii in Italy. And we all know of the ancient Italian city that was preserved. So this scale here, that's 1 mile across. So every one of these diagrams we're looking at, these figureground diagrams we're looking at, are about a mile across, which is 1.6 kilometers. And the arrow is pointing up. That's the north point. So every map, every plan should be drawn so that north is up the page. Should. And you can see here we've got a variety of different streets. You've got larger streets and smaller streets, and it is generally in a grid pattern. There are a few dead ends at certain points, but that could have more to do with where it was, maybe on the coastline, or what is built around. But the idea of this diagram is just to give us a really simple and easy to understand representation of the street layouts here. So you can see you've got here is a main street, I would assume, going all the way down, a large one. It's breaking off. You've got other ones approaching it. So we'll have a look now at it this is a plan view of a typical street. Okay, and this was on the left. We've got Herculaneum. We've got Pompeii on the right, and there's different sections through the street to get an understanding of it. So the Pompeii streets, Herculaneum streets, Ostia, Antica. Oh, you got to love my attempts at at Latin. In the field, and I'm reading here from their book about ancient streets. In the field, a sense of scale of these streets is difficult without buildings. At Herculaneum, where buildings remain, the scale is a pleasant one for a pedestrian. No sense of crowding despite small dimensions. This might have been different if there were many people on them. Nonetheless, the term human scale is appropriate. Walkways, as opposed to cartways, take a large proportion of any of these streets. And you can see here, you've got up the center at a lower point. You can see in the diagram, you've got the pedestrian person there, scale, and slightly lower is the cartway. Here on these streets as well. Streets are regular in layout, so they're easy to navigate and find your way around, not like the dead-end cul-de-sacs we have in all of our suburbia. The basic physical elements of contemporary streets are all there. Commercial uses, such as corner eating places, existed on these streets. And also, I think Sargon of Akkad has a good video about the naughty words. That's it. Brothel graffiti. And that was quite interesting to hear. Street dimensions were a matter of choice. They could have been larger had there been a desire or need. Proportions and dimensions are remarkably similar to those in the Paddington section of Sydney, Australia. So there you go. There you are. Sydney, Australia is similar to these ancient buildings. And you can just see the scale here. This is a section through the street. And this is important to analyze how, the size of it, the height of the buildings, the scale of, how high a person, how it feels to you psychologically as you're walking and using the streets. Just the widths. And this is an important way to analyze it. So you go from this scale here where you look at the entire street to the sections here. And then we'll move. Oh, I've got Berlin there. We'll look at, we'll look at Berlin. So this is from the, historic center in 1986. You can see here you've got the, portion of Berlin, and then we've got some of the U-Bahn going across, or the S-Bahn. U-Bahn's above, S-Bahn's below, isn't it? I hope. I should know. I haven't been to Berlin in a while. And forgive the yellow on this image, it's the way I photographed it. And we can see here, once again, this is a commercial street, so it's slightly different to the one we were looking at before, even though that had commercial aspects to it. So this is in the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. Oh, my German is rusty. My reading in German is probably as good as my reading in English. So a central significant street with a long history, dating as a boulevard from around the late 1800s, it continually changes and evolves. And once again, I'm reading from this Great Streets. A fine street, a better street in 91 than in 73, when there were no trees in the central planting strip. So in 73, there were no trees, and they've added them here. And we can see in the section, you can get an understanding of the scale. We've got the people here. You know, you've got a building here, you've got another one there, and you've got a nice green tree space. And the scale of the trees too, that's important, because we're going to look at some examples here where the scales in some of our projects will change, or the examples that we're looking at will change over time, you'd hope. Many people of all ages, and perhaps of many incomes, a true central community street. Many are strolling, talking, a place to walk, a pleasant sense of informality. The street has a distinct starting point, but no sense of an end, despite appearances of a bending or turning point at Liebenstrasse, at the Brandenburgstrasse. Many stores sell a wide variety of goods, all with windows that invite looking inside. There are also many eating places and movie houses, especially at corners. Department stores are close to the center. Upper floors appear to be mostly used for offices and business, though some residences, especially in older buildings. So you can see there, you know, that there's some activity at multiple levels. Side streets are developed with apartment blocks, high density in buildings of less than 10 stories. The ground floor have commercial uses. Moving westward from the central area, the buildings and stores get larger, with more housing. Some higher style, more expensive stores, but also larger stores, less ornate to comparative, fast-turning shopping, oriental rugs, furniture, yada yada yada. Generally in summer, the view is kept low of branches, leaves, storefronts, not of buildings. So there you are. In winter it'd be a different thing. You can also see here where you've got the columns. So you've got a protected space running along here. Same thing here with the building, a protected space with the building coming over. So you've got two options. You can walk under the trees, or you can walk under the protected space from the elements, which is an issue walking around the streets of Brisbane, I can tell you, particularly when it rains. And now let's have a look at Paddington in Sydney that was mentioned here. And we can just see the figure ground diagram. This is a slightly different scale to the other ones, but it can give you an idea of the building density, built form, and the clear space around it. So this is a kind of like a nollie map in some ways, because where you could publicly access, as opposed to the other ones which were a figure ground diagram, just giving an idea of the blocks in the streets. But you can still get an appreciation of the block sizes and where the streets would be cutting through. These here are obviously the backs, at the back of the block, and the front here, I'd hope. We'll have to see. So, and here we have, you know, Paddington Streets in Sydney. And once again, you can see just the scale of the streets. And now we have vehicles on here as opposed to Pompeii. But you've got a pedestrian zone here with some tree planting. You've got the built form. Here, the same thing. The scale is a human one. So it's amazingly dense. And once again, I'm reading from the book. Small scale, single family, terraced housing streets. Many houses are as little as 12 feet wide. Net residential density are 50 dwelling units per acre along some streets. Truly high for single family houses. Public right-of-way of 40 feet are common, so the roads. No off-street parking, so cars park on narrow 20-foot streets that are crowded and slow-moving. The entire right-of-way becomes pedestrian-orientated. Yes, I think I remember driving there. Some 4-foot wide sidewalks have trees planted along them. Buildings setbacks of 5 feet are often planted with shrubs. Setbacks and narrow porches are major socializing community building areas. The street's right-of-way is not unlike Roslyn Place in Pittsburgh. Essentially different are the closeness of Paddington homes to the street and their continuous facade. So you're getting a high level of density here, but you can imagine walking around this space and how comfortable it would be. You know, at a human scale, people are interacting. Traffic will generally slow down just because of the tightness of the street. I've driven in these streets there. I've gone there yeah, I've gone there in a car. I think I drove, or maybe I was too scared to drive. But you get a tightness of the street, and that affects the traffic and the flow. So here there are 3 examples from ancient time all the way to contemporary Sydney here. Now, the second book, and the first I mentioned that I want to look at, is from a pattern language here. Now, what we'll do is there's a series of different rules in the book, and once again, I'll hold it up. Here it is. I'll wait for it to come into focus. Now, there are how many rules? You can see it's been well loved. It's got a whole lot of markings on it and things there. How many rules? A lot. So it goes from Rule 1, which is independent regions. Rule 2 is the distribution of towns, all the way to Rule 253, things from your life. And it even talks about colors in different rules. This is a very useful book, particularly for students who are studying architecture. And what we'll do is each rule is set up like this. You've got, the number of the rule, and they explain it, different patterns that, well, it's not really a rule, it's more pattern. Sorry, I should be using pattern. The number of the pattern, and then other patterns that are associated with it. And there's a little summary here, and we'll read through that, not the whole thing. You can go into greater detail and research that is used to justify these design decisions. And this is the one thing that frustrates me with all of the, bureaucratic publications that come out, is the lack of academic rigor in a lot of it. It really is. Even my discussing with Richard Hames about his methodology, I've been dwelling on it. I'm concerned with the inherent bias in the sources that he uses, because they're not going to be able to account for ideological differences in their group. But I somehow think he doesn't care. So, Rule 61: small public squares. Small public squares. And I've just picked a selection of these rules that I think are relevant for what we're going to be looking at. A town needs public squares. They are the largest, most public rooms that the town has. But when they are too large, they look and feel deserted. So that's just something to be aware of. There's a picture example here. We've got a few more as well. You can see here in the figure ground diagram, they're looking at just a concept of a square. Make a public square much smaller than you would at first imagine, usually no more than 45 to 60 feet across, never more than 70 feet across. This applies only to its width in the short direction. In the long direction, it can certainly be longer. So you can see there just the scale they're trying to get, because this is to do with the human interaction, use of the space, and how it's occupied. Because if it's too big, it just, is appropriate maybe for certain spaces, but not, this would be the type of stuff you want around and in and interacting with these developments that we're looking at. 95 is building complexity. So a building cannot be a human building unless it is complex of still smaller. A building cannot be a human building unless it is a complex of still smaller buildings or smaller parts which manifest its own internal social facts. So you want the building, you can see here in the image, you want it to express what's happening inside, and you want an element of complexity in the building. And a lot of that has been lost because it's so cheaper to build these boring boxes. These boring boxes. I mean, we'll look at some images from Mascot in a moment, and we'll jump back to it and just notice the difference. And never build large monolithic buildings. Wherever possible, translate your building program into a building complex whose parts manifest the actual social facts of the situation. At low density, a building complex may take the form of a collection of small buildings connected by arcades, paths, bridges, shared gardens, and walls. At higher density, a single building can be treated as a building complex if its important parts are picked out and made identifiable while still part of the three-dimensional fabric. Even a small building, a house for example, can be conceived of as a building complex. Perhaps parts of it's higher than the rest, and the wings are an adjoining a cottage. And then the advantage is you get spaces in between that can be used. So number 96 is the number of stories. And that's going to be very important for what we're looking at. Particularly, we jump back quickly here. You can see in these sections the number of stories in Paddington, and that affects your psychology, that affects how you use the space, that affects how you feel when you're walking up the street. In all these different examples, even going right back to Pompeii. So here, within the 4-story height limit, so they're aiming for a 4-story height limit of the building. Just exactly how high should your building be? So they're drawing this upon another pattern to look at, a 4-story height limit. And then they're talking about breaking the rule of thumb. First, decide how many square feet of building space you need and divide it by the area of the site to get the floor area ratio. Then choose the height of your buildings according to the floor area ratio and the height of the surrounding buildings from the following table. In no case, build on more than 50% of the land. So you can see here they've got a little rule of thumb for the height of the building and height of surrounding buildings. So if it's 3 and the floor area ratio there, the ratio of built form to the site area or the floor area. You can have a look there. How you going? So I'd with a lot of these buildings, they're at such a high scale that it, and you can see the example here, that it really dehumanizes these design. Now, shielded parking. Now, this is interesting. It's one to consider. With a lot of these, we're going to have basement parking. So large parking structures full of cars are inhumane, and dead buildings. No one wants to see them or walk by them. At the same time, if you're driving, the entrance to a parking structure is essentially the main entrance to the building and needs to be visible. So this is another concept here where they're looking at just shielding the parking structures with a building at the front, which not part of the examples we'll be looking at here, but in a commercial parts of the city, yeah. And a lot of the time, this is not really something to worry about. Rather in the suburbs, I think in part of Mascot, you can see it in like the Bunnings and those type of things, with these huge, or shopping malls with these huge desert car parks surrounding by a building, when you'd rather invert it to activate the street. And then here, rule 106, positive outdoor space. Outdoor spaces which are merely left over between buildings in general will not be used. You can see the difference here. Leftover spaces and used space. And here's another example. So from this, transition from this to this. You can see here some more options. Make all of the outdoor space which surrounds and lies between your building positive. Give each one some degree of enclosure, surrounding each space with wings of buildings, trees, hedges, fences, arcades, trestled walks, until it becomes an entity with a positive quality and does not spill out indefinitely around corners. So, I need a coffee. We've had a look at some, ancient streets, contemporary streets, and just got an understanding of the feel of it. We've looked at just a few patterns here that we should consider when we're designing. Now let's have a look at Mascot. So first we'll jump here. You can see here we've got a density to it where this is the street grid we're looking at here. Bigger streets here, down bigger blocks. But if we're looking, and this is at 77 at Burke Street, just look up the street here. What's the first thing you notice here? You've got very high built structures. You've got office here with no opportunity for engagement at the street. You've got some planting here, but the trees aren't providing that much shade. At least they are providing some, and they're breaking it up. Same thing here. The trees are not as high as the examples that we were looking at, here, even in Germany. I mean, look at the scale of these streets, and then we'll jump over to Mascot here, and we look at the scale of those ones. You've got some activity here, but I suspect that's people waiting to catch a bus. You can see they're all on the phone, standing there waiting, or maybe catching a cab. We scroll down further. This is another part there. We've got more planting there, which is good. More planting. It's all smaller planting, though. And you've got, once again, these high buildings coming up here. High buildings coming up here. Very monolithic facades. Sure, they're broken up a little bit, but look at that height. Look at that height. And they're dead during the day. because there's some clothes there are apartments there's no activity. There's no activity. People buy these apartments, they spend a fortune on them, and how much time do you spend in there? You sleep in there pretty much. Here's another view. And here, I mean, once again, you've got apartments there, and we've got some commercial activity attempting to activate the corner. But, you know, you've got this big, I'm assuming it's maintenance and ventilation for the railway that's gone underneath. But, you know, the corner's dead. The corner's dead. Step back the building as well. And even that, I mean, you'd want them to actually do something a bit better than just a bare wall with some signs on it. And that, if that's a civic piece of work, it shows you where our civilization sits with regards to, you know, what we respect. Here we've got another corner kind of set back from MGM properties. There's no really activity there or life on the street. There's a few people walking there. There's trees. You know, it feels very high, very inhuman. And it's, you know, where are the little courtyards, the little spaces that we have that are accessible to the public? How can you activate it? And plus the buildings are, you know, I mean, we can look at them, look how monolithic they look. Let's jump back to pattern here. We look here, that, you know, building complexity. Okay, I'll take a snip of this. So we'll just take the building complexity one. We'll go back here to look at Mascot, and we'll just bring over the building complexity here. If we have a look, I mean, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? You've got traditionally much greater complexity in the buildings just due to the structure. And here, look, we've got a complete blank wall just there, pretty much, with 3 windows and a few little cutouts, and, you know, some balconies here. And I am sure the architect would have designed it with more complexity, or they just give up because it always gets removed. And, you know, so we've got, you know, some layering here. There's on this side, there's, you know, there's a feature here to define the corner. The issue is, it's just, it feels very high, and there's no life in it. So it affects how people can relate to it. So, jumping back to here, some of the claims that were happening, you know, with these buildings, it is a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge. We're getting these horribly built buildings that are now full of defects. We've got it happening again and again and again. People are paying a fortune for these things. And some of the, you know, the patterns and rules that we want to get a comfortable city for people to live in, they don't seem to be occurring, do they? You know, there was an attempt here. It feels a bit dirty and all over the place, doesn't it? I guess when it grows bigger and larger, you know, give it time. Give it time. Hopefully that these trees here will all grow to this scale. But still, you want to try and get a bit more activity in the space. It's not the hustle and bustle. It's just cars coming and going. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think. Thanks for joining me for this episode. I think it's good that this discussion is being had. But, I mean, you know, come on. I mean, look at this. This is the other side of that building we were looking at before. How does that make you feel going up the street there? Look at this back here. I mean, look at that. That's just gross, really, to be honest. Anyway, guys, like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you all again next time. Bye for now.